stop. Or wait, actually, don't stop necessarily, but pay attention to this. So this video is supposed to work in conjunction with chapter 26 of the American pageant. There's a lot of stuff going on in the West, and it doesn't really lend itself to, let's say, a linear sort of story-based lecture. So, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to talk about the highlights of that reading, the things that you should really be familiar with. So, you can use this video for a couple of different purposes. You can use it to kind of review what you've already covered in the reading, or the video can help guide you in that reading. But you should make sure that you're familiar with chapter 26. So let's talk about cowboys and the American West. It's kind of weird that we're getting to the West at this point of the course, right? Because we talked about the West as an idea and as a destination for a very long time. And once more, we're talking about the West again. But the West has been kind of an evolving concept. Case in point, I'm going to skip ahead and find a map here. Actually, I'm going to appropriate a different map. But if you think about American history in general, again, it's been one constant story of Western movement and migration, but you can sometimes be deceived as to how that Western migration takes place. Obviously, the Eastern Seaboard is occupied first by Europeans, and then what kind of happens is that you see basically European American migration into the West, but it kind of stops right around this area. And around the 1830s and 1840s, you start to see migration to places like Texas, New Mexico, California, Oregon, formerly called Rupert's Land, but all this stuff in the middle, Nevada, Wyoming, uh, Arizona to a certain extent, Utah, oh well, except for the Mormons, that's not really settled until the very end. And that's really what we're talking about in this lecture, because this part of the American West, the true sort of last vestige of the frontier, hasn't really been settled because of a multitude of different reasons. Either because the technology doesn't really exist yet to effectively farm it, or because kind of the path of least resistance leads European Americans to settle in more lucrative land, or let's say more land that possessed more gold, like in the case of California. And finally, a lot of this territory right here is also occupied by Native American tribes that are militarily well organized and well positioned to resist America, or let's say European American encroachment. So that's kind of the big overall point here. Well, we're not just talking about the West as a general cardinal direction. We're talking about this West actually. So here's what you should kind of be familiar with. The 1890s is a time period where the American frontier is being closed. Like all major land is being incorporated as settlements and territories. And Frederick Jackson Turner is an American historian who comes up with a famous thesis called the Frontier Thesis. This Frontier Thesis argues that what makes American culture and American society different from cultures and societies in Europe is that Europe never had a Western frontier. Basically, Europe was geographically finite. On the other hand, if you're looking at the United States, there's always that pull the frontier. And Turner's argument is that American culture is always focused on the frontier because basically American culture never gets a chance to really settle and develop like you see in Europe. And so his argument is that you'll see frontier culture kind of dominate society until the frontier itself closes. And at that point, Jackson Turner argues, there's going to be some kind of reckoning, that American history will change forever. Now, this is the 1890s, and so what we can say as kind of a spoiler is that around this time period, we see the emergence of these movements for radical political reform called the Progressive Movement. We also see the United States become an overseas empire. So, one of the arguments is that when we talk about American imperialism, maybe American imperialism is just manifest destiny with boats instead of Conestoga wagons. So that's a discussion that we'll sort of talk about more when we get to the Spanish-American War. But this time period that we associate with the raw, untamed West, the reason that it becomes mythologized is precisely because the West was increasingly becoming tamed and settled. And so in U.S. history, there's always been that sort of promise of the frontier, and that there's almost infinite possibility and possibilities and wealth waiting for enterprising individuals to claim it. What happens if suddenly the infinite frontier is not so infinite? What if it completely dissipates? So that's something to keep in the back of your minds. But this is the time period that we associate with widespread cattle ranching, the time of the cowboys. But just so you know, and to be honest, this is one of those points where historians have the unenviable task of demythologizing things. You would not want your child to be a cowboy if you wanted them to be successful. Being a cowboy was dull, dangerous, and it also didn't pay very well. Basically, it paid the equivalent of minimum wage, which we don't really have anyway during the Gilded Age because there are no worker protection laws or consumer protection laws during this time period. But actually, the first cowboys, it should be noted, were from Mexico and Latin America in general. They were called the vaqueros. And so not only were roughly 1/3 of the original cowboys from Mexico, 20% of them were African American as well. And it should be noted that a lot of times on these cattle drives to railway centers like Abilene, for example, those cattle drives could last over 800 miles. Basically, by the way, a lot of these cows could basically strip bare the topsoil. They would just graze everything along the way, which might make you kind of upset if you're the owner of that property. And actually, there's this kind of ongoing war in the West between sheep farmers and cattle ranchers as to who got to use sort of land that was available. But again, being a cowboy was not a prestigious job. This is kind of one of those depressing things where, again, I have to demythologize things. And again, these cattle drives could required a lot of land because cows are kind of hungry and thirsty things. So if you owned property along one of these big cattle drives, the question is, how do you protect your property? And so this is where Joseph Gliden's very famous invention, barbed wire, comes in handy because it allowed people to sort of fence their property off from cow farmers. Also, the reason that barbed wire becomes important is not just to satisfy the territorial ambitions of property owners in the Midwest, but also the territorial ambitions of European despots and politicians. Basically, if you can create razor sharp steel wire to keep cattle out, well, can't you do the same thing for humans? And so this barbed wire is employed to a massive degree on the various battlefronts of World War I. And even though barbed wire doesn't necessarily kill too many people outright, it stalls a lot of the advances over no man's land and basically pins troops in position where they can be picked off by machine gun and artillery fire. So if you look at this sort of push west into the West, a lot of it comes from the Homestead Act of 1862. And again, this is a government initiative to encourage people to basically take responsibility for 160-acre plots. So basically, if you farmed it for at least 5 years and improved it, in other words, you built a house on it or something, you would own that land outright in fee simple. In other words, you just own that property. Over 500,000 people basically take the government up on this offer. And so this is, you see this in particular in places like Kansas and Nebraska and a lot of these Midwestern states and territories, but also it brings European Americans into conflict with very powerful Native American tribes, most notably the Sioux, the Nez Perce, and the Apache. And by the way, just to give you guys some background here. By the way, we're talking about a large number of different tribal organizations. Unfortunately, we can't go into too much detail in any one tribe, so sometimes they're just collectively called the Great Plains Indians. But these are Indian tribes that, at the very least, have some kind of lifestyle that revolves around hunter-gathering, particularly with the buffalo. And we mentioned that many of these tribes at the very beginning of the course, actually, could kind of be classified as winners of the Columbian Exchange. Remember that the Native American population declined by like 90% just within a century of the Columbian Exchange, but that didn't apply evenly across the board. If you looked at, for example, the Taino people of the island of Hispaniola, 90% was more like 100%. On the flip side, the Great Plains Indians were so far removed from European interaction that they sort of developed this immunological advantage where they only start to engage in trade with Europeans and European Americans right around the same time that there's a working smallpox vaccine. And if you remember, it was really smallpox that was the true killer of many of the Native American tribes. So what happens is that tribes like the Sioux emerge during the early 19th century as being one of the few major Native American tribes left that have military power. So the other thing, though, is that their hunter-gatherer lifestyle also makes them incredibly effective fighters. Most hunter-gatherers, just anthropologically, tend to have societies that are, let's say, really that are militarily effective. Because the thing is that if you train your whole life to hunt and shoot a buffalo, those skill sets are fungible to tracking down and hunting and killing another human being. So the Sioux, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Nez Perce, the Apache, these were all societies that were, I would say, very militarily effective, even in comparison to some of the other tribes that we talked about in the very beginning. And what also has to be said is that tribes like the Sioux kind of had like this special sort of Native American equivalent of manifest destiny. During the 19th century, the Sioux actually went out and subjugated and conquered other tribes. So you can kind of see this inevitable collision between some of these powerful tribes and European American settlers. But really, the main source of conflict is the fact that with the expansion of the Transcontinental Railroad, railroad companies placed bounties on the hunting of buffalo. Spoiler, Native American tribes in the Great Plains region basically depended for the buffalo on for everything. Native Americans who hunted the buffalo would usually use every part of a buffalo that they hunted and killed. And what happens is that these railroad companies would, again, place bounties on the buffalo, and it results in their population almost completely collapsing. So some of these paid sharpshooters, like Buffalo Bill Cody, kill something like 4,300 buffalo in 8 months. And it's not really a very sporting thing. These guys would just kind of like, sit in a train and just kind of like do buffalo drive-bys. So from 1872 to 1875, in just 3 years, over 9 million buffalo are killed out of a total population of 32 million. So there's a couple of different reasons for that. One is that buffalo were big and heavy enough that if they were hit by trains, that could cause some significant damage. Uh, Also, buffalo skins were very popular, but the other reason is that the United States Army, which is principally responsible for policing the West, especially policing Native American tribes, realizes that if the buffalo population collapses, many of these militarily imposing tribes will face starvation. And when that happens, if these tribes are vulnerable enough, they might have to depend upon the United States government for aid. And so the idea is that if these Native American tribes are dependent upon the government for their next meal, they're less likely to rise up in opposition. So, what this kind of leads to is this actually leads to a discussion on Native American policy in general. You might remember when we talked about the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act, which was passed during the Jackson administration, that this kind of sets the stage for this federal government policy of encouraging Native Americans to live on their own reservations. And at least theoretically, the logic was that these policies were put into place to protect the culture of Native American tribes. But in reality, if you're relocating tribes to areas that are utterly alien to them, like, for example, relocating the Cherokee to Oklahoma, well, then you're also kind of destroying their country as well. Also, the fact that it's kind of wrong to take people's land away and boot them to Nowheresville, Oklahoma. But anyway, so in 1851, you have a treaty in Fort Laramie that's signed in Fort Laramie, in which the Sioux are given a reservation in Black Hills, South Dakota. So theoretically, these reservations are protected by federal law, but in practice, the truth is a little bit more disturbing. So if you take a look at what happened in Colorado, Colorado's Governor John Evans basically gives local militia groups a blank check to go after Native American tribes like the Cheyenne. A group of Coloradan volunteers actually decides to raid Cheyenne territory, and Governor Evans gives it his full blessing. So at that point, there is a Cheyenne chief named Black Kettle who goes to a federal fort, and he receives orders from a local leader to set up a camp nearby. And at that point, the Colorado militia rides up, and they're mostly drunk, and they just massacre the entire population. Over 133 Cheyenne are killed in what's called the Sand Creek Massacre, including Chief Black Kettle, who is apparently killed while waving a white flag in one hand and an American flag in another. It's like, what else was the guy supposed to do? And this was kind of an extreme example, but this wasn't an isolated example of how violence by European American settlers could be visited upon Native American tribes in the area. So many of these types of conflicts actually precipitates a conflict called Red Cloud's War. And Red Cloud's War, interestingly, is a war in which the Great Plains Indians in general actually win a conflict against white settlers and the United States Army. And not only is this historically significant because it is a rare Native American military victory in a war against white settlers, but it also has the most outstanding name in American history. So Red Cloud is pretty boss. And then you have this guy, man afraid of his horses. Spoiler, he wasn't afraid of his horses. He's my favorite character in U.S. history. That's just such an awesome name. Anyway, so not only did the Lakota and other tribes achieve a military victory in Red Cloud's War, they actually get a favorable peace treaty signed in what's called the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie was kind of a big deal back then. So this treaty basically stipulated that, once again, Native Americans sort of enjoyed the right to land and territory in the Black Hills area of South Dakota, and this was going to be considered a Native American reservation. But also, what's really interesting is that you can see that Native American leaders, even though they just achieved a major military victory in this conflict, at the same time, you see sort of a resignation that at the very end, European Americans aren't going anywhere. White settlers are here to stay. And so the treaty also stipulated, for example, that minors should be provided with an English education, that Native Americans should learn how to farm. So, in other words, you get the sense that there's this slow but steady acceptance of the fact that, this hunter-gatherer lifestyle is eventually going to come to an end to a certain extent. Not everybody, it should be known, was necessarily thrilled with this idea, especially some of the younger members of the warrior class that we'll talk about in the next little bit. But also, the people who were not satisfied with this treaty were individuals who heard that, lo and behold, there was gold discovered in the Ndar Hills. If you guys have ever heard of Black Hills gold. So remember that, gold rushes in American history are kind of rare. And so when they happen, it kind of creates this gold fever, gold madness. Think Lord of the Rings Gollum style insanity. And so white settlers increasingly come out to the Black Hills region and violate the language of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And so what happens is that there's conflicts between the settlers. The U.S. Army deploys ostensibly to kind of mediate the conflict and to play referee. But the reality is that the Army tends to sympathize with, you guessed it, the white settlers there. So this leads to basically the chain of events that we associate with the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Treaty of Fort Laramie guaranteed that the Sioux would have the right to the Black Hills area of South Dakota, quote, as long as the grass shall grow. Unfortunately, the treaty failed to stipulate what should happen if gold was discovered. Should make no difference realistically, but the white settlers themselves thought differently. So this triggers the Great Sioux War that rages from 1876 to 1877. So what happens is that in the summer of 1876, Colonel George Armstrong Custer and a unit called the 7th Cavalry, which numbers about 284 soldiers, is lured into an ambush that is basically planned by two military leaders from the Sioux, Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And what happens is that the 7th Cavalry rushes in and is massacred almost to a man. So what's also kind of interesting is that, we tend to think throughout American history that generally white soldiers fought with superior technology compared to Native Americans. And we've talked about a number of different instances where that's not true, but in actual fact, the Battle of Little Bighorn is actually a great example of that. Most of the Sioux warriors who fought against Custer's 7th Cavalry were actually better armed than the U.S. Army. So what happens is that because Custer and his unit dies so melodramatically, suddenly there's this popular outcry. And one of the tragic consequences for the Sioux is that they're so successful that at this point, the United States Army and the U.S. government decides that that embarrassment is just too great to let stand. So here is Sitting Bull, who has just achieved his greatest triumph, the defeat of an American army in open battle. And again, we're only talking about 200 to 300 people, but This is also the time period in which European imperialism is kind of reaching across the world. It's a time period where European armies were able to conquer vast swaths of unsettled land with minimal casualties. So the fact that you have this major, crushing defeat for the United States Army, again, was very embarrassing. So embarrassing, in fact, that it ultimately spells, doom for the Sioux, because suddenly the United States Army focuses all its efforts on defeating the Sioux. Now, the thing is that the U.S. Army kind of decides not to openly fight the Sioux in battle. Instead, they decide to drive them north and to starve them out. And eventually, the Sioux are forced to surrender. What this also kind of causes is a reassessment of Native American policy. So this is kind of where the history of history becomes important. So in 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book called A Century of Dishonor, which basically goes over most of the major treaties between whites and Native Americans from the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie on down. And her thesis is that, we were pretty darn dishonorable towards the Native Americans in terms of not keeping our word, especially whenever our word came at the expense of valuable natural resources like gold, and so this basically it was a tale of kind of a tragic story of just how abused and mistreated Native Americans were during this time period. In fact, Helen Hunt Jackson writes the following quote, and by the way, I don't have a great Helen Hunt Jackson impression. I'm sorry, I'll work on it. It would seem that there could be found nowhere in the melancholy record of the experiences of our Indians a more glaring instance of confused multiplication of injustices than this. The Cheyenne were pursued and slain for venturing to leave this very reservation, which it appears is not their reservation at all, and they have no legal right to it. Are there any words to fitly characterize such treatment as this from a great, powerful, rich nation to a handful of helpless people? So Helen Hunt Jackson is a good example of somebody who kind of views Native Americans as being innocent and worthy of protection. And again, we've talked about that perspective throughout American history, and how, on the one hand, there is compassion, but at the same time, it's a perspective that doesn't really view Native Americans as being completely equal. They kind of are seen as being exotic and kind of set apart from white society. But at the very least, if you can say that there's a very least, Jackson did not hold openly genocidal attitudes towards Native Americans, which, by the way, was still a very common attitude during this time period. Interestingly, especially on the East Coast to a certain extent, it's really interesting when you hear about the fact that it's a lot of the people in the intelligentsia, the literary classes, who are so vociferously against Native Americans. People like Mark Twain, for instance. Anyway, you would. Helen Hunt Jackson, by the way, is also an example of something else that we'll see increasingly as we get to the Progressive era. A journalist slash historian slash writer, usually one of those three kind of general things, who puts their pen to the service of a cause and writes a short, sort of inflammatory expose. And by the way, I don't mean inflammatory in like a negative connotation, but if you write a title or write a book with the title A Century of Dishonor, it's a fair bet that you're trying to tug on some heartstrings. And Helen Hunt Jackson definitely succeeded. What she maybe couldn't imagine is the consequences of how successful she could be. So at the close of the Great Sioux War, there is this pushback against the very concept of the reservation system. And instead what happens is you start to see this gradual shift towards assimilation. So instead of letting Native Americans sort of exist on their own reservations that are self-governing, instead the focus is on forcing Native Americans to abandon their tribal traditions, culture, and religion, and instead convert to Christianity of some kind, especially Protestant Christianity, and to abandon hunter-gathering in favor of farming. So what happens is that there is basically a school that's set up in 1879 by an Army veteran by the name of Richard H. Pratt. It is called the Carlisle Indian School, which is basically like, if you remember, by the way, those praying towns in New England, yeah, basically it's almost like a more sort of streamlined industrial version of those. The idea is that you destroy Native American culture and basically raise young Native American children as white children. And to be honest, they were very blunt about that mission. Their slogan was, quote, "Kill the Indian and save the man." Work your head around that, by the way. So that's kind of the policy going forward. Is the idea is that Native Americans will be forced to assimilate in some way, shape, or form, and you have these sort of haunting before and after shots of Native American children when they're first sent to the school, and then when they're about ready to graduate. And of course, they're taught other skills there. But basically, the idea is, again, that they are going to sort of assimilate into broader white American society. And remember that a lot of the decline of the Native American population in general wasn't necessarily just because of deaths from wars and disease, etc., but also because of assimilations. The thing is that at least for some Native Americans throughout history, that assimilation had been somewhat voluntary, not consistently, but in this case, there's no real voluntariness. Remember that in the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, you saw Native American leaders express interest in giving their kids at least some exposure to white customs. And now what's happening is that that's being sort of shoved down the throats of Native Americans on the Great Plains. So that all leads up to the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. What you need to know about the Dawes Act is that this eliminates the reservation system. It basically takes all land owned by Native Americans up to that point, and basically makes it available for them to purchase, and also makes that land available to be purchased from outside buyers and businesses. The thing is that very often many Native Americans found themselves kind of, cheated out of their own land, which was bought up by railroads, businesses, corporations, etc. And basically the idea is that the land that was held in the reservation system would become fair game like it was under the Homestead Act. In other words, people are all going to buy 160-acre plots. Well, the problem, though, is that a lot of the land that's available a lot of the land that was on the reservation system is terrible land. It's not really great land for farming. A lot of that land has already been taken. So many of these Native American tribes, like the Sioux, for example, find themselves grappling with problems of potential starvation. Then what happens is, looking at all of these conflicts and frustrations, in the 1880s and 1890s, we see the emergence of a religious movement called the Ghost Dance Movement, which is started by a charismatic Native American religious leader by the name of Wovoka. Wovoka believed that by sort of engaging in ritualistic dances, not only could they control rainfall and bring water to thirsty crops, but they could actually make themselves impervious to bullets. And remember that at this point, anytime you see a massive sort of Native American religious revival in which you see kind of like bits and pieces of Judeo-Christianity mixed in with, native shamanistic beliefs, that usually kind of sets the stage for a major revolt. We saw this in King Philip's War. We saw this with Pontiac's Rebellion. We saw this with Tecumseh and the Prophets Revolt. So it's been kind of a thing. And so at this point, the U.S. Army tries to get ahead of it. And this sort of leads us on the path to the Battle of Wounded Knee. What also kind of disturbed white settlers is the fact that Wovoka also prophesied that Jesus Christ had returned to Earth as a Native American. And so again, we see kind of elements of, Christianity sort of being mixed with traditional religious practices and beliefs. So settlers were jumpy enough that they asked the military to step in and basically clamp down on the Ghost Dance movement. Wovoka himself was a member of the Sioux tribe, and so a federal detachment was sent to basically clamp down the movement. What happened, though, is that this force was kind of confronted by a group of Native Americans who were told that their shirts and their dances made them invulnerable. So what happens, of course, is that, not really of course actually, what happens horrifically is that the U.S. Army opens fire on the Native Americans. Over 300 of them are killed, including women and children. So at least at first, this incident is called the Battle of Wounded Knee. And to be honest, that's a little ridiculous because it was less this and more this. It was really a massacre because a battle presupposes that one side or that both sides actually have kind of a chance. And I mean, that certainly wasn't the case, especially since the Army brought out, actually superior technology in the form of modern machine guns. And basically the people who were killed weren't really trained warriors as much as just, members of the community. So by the way, Chief Sitting Bull lives in Standing Rock, South Dakota, which is right nearby, and he is also killed in a standoff with U.S. Army officers. So this is kind of considered the last battle, air quotes, in which United States soldiers clash with Native Americans. So this kind of ends, this part of the course on a depressing note, where at this point, Native Americans have lost their homes, and they've, in many cases, especially if you look at the Battle of Wounded Knee, they've lost their lives, and thanks to the assimilation policies put into place, they've also lost their culture and their history. And so if you look at the next the last century. From Helen Hunt Jackson's perspective, it's not only been a century of dishonor, it's been a century of horror. In 1800, the Native American population numbered around 600,000. By 1890, that number has dropped to 228,000. The reservation system does make a comeback, but we have to wait until the Great Depression and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal to get there. So see you next time.